Welcome back to Inside the Vatican. I'm your host, Colleen Dulle. Jerry is out this week, so joining me as co-host is David Gibson, director of the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University. Good morning from New Orleans, David.
Yeah, great to be here. I wish I were in New Orleans, but
Yeah, it's still a little bit cold and gross out here, so
oh
I think
yeah,
you're not missing much.
keep telling me that. Okay.
Our listeners might remember you from our conclave episode. We did an episode together right after the cardinals went into conclave, talking about what was going on in the room, what we knew about it, and what would happen next. And David, you recently published an op-ed in the New York Times that we'll be talking about in this episode called Pope Leo Confronts Trump on His Own Terms. So together this week, we'll be talking about Pope Leo's foreign policy, especially as relates to the recent developments in Venezuela. So let's get right into it. As our listeners will know, on January 3rd, the U.S. carried out a special military operation to remove the Venezuelan president Nicolas Maduro and his wife from the country. The operation killed some 75 people, and it's raised a lot of questions about the future of Venezuela. But David, this is Inside the Vatican, so we're going to talk about the Vatican's involvement here. Can you give me some of the background? I know that Venezuela is a Catholic majority country, and their relations go way back with the Vatican, right?
Indeed, they go back to 1869 in the 19th century when, again, all of the national movements were emerging across South America, and these nations were kind of throwing off the colonial shackles. So they have a long history there, but they also have a more recent involvement under, again, Hugo Chavez, the semi-dictator, I think you could rightly call him, before Maduro, coincided with the time that the current Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, served as the Vatican nuncio, the Vatican ambassador to Venezuela. That was about 2009 to 2013, I believe, before he was called to the Vatican by Pope Francis.
Right. And then about a decade ago, so shortly after Parolin's time there, the Vatican was actually involved in some mediation between Maduro and the opposition, but that never really succeeded. But still, the Vatican, remained involved, remained connected to the country. And it's important for us to note also that Cardinal Parolin's number two, the sostituto, the substitute of the Secretary of State, is also a Venezuelan.
Archbishop Para, so there are those long connections there, deep connections, and again, Parolin has those personal connections, which I think came into play in this most recent crisis. But it's also, I think, which will kind of emerge in our conversation, the Vatican is always trying to place itself as a mediator, as a kind of buffer, at the very least, in a lot of these conflicts. So it's not unusual that they would volunteer their auspices, their spaces, even in one of the nunciatures, something like that. But it's also not unusual that that the offer would not be accepted. It's often a standing effort on the part of the Vatican to try and ease confrontations, to try and stop wars from happening. But you've got to have two willing parties on either side to take it up, and that often doesn't happen.
Yeah, we've talked about that often on the show, especially in relation to Russia and Ukraine. The Pope has offered this as a forum, the Vatican as a forum where dialogue could happen, and you do have to have the willing parties, like you said. So let's go back to this fall when things really started heating up. Around September, you have the kind of threats from President Trump about regime change or hinting at that beginning. And at the same time, the U.S. starts building up its military in the Caribbean. And then in early October, Maduro says that he sent a letter to Pope Leo asking him to help preserve and achieve peace and stability. He doesn't give any details about the letter, and the Vatican doesn't comment on it. I don't think they even confirmed whether they received the letter or not. But so it's interesting that from the beginning, Maduro is reaching out to the Vatican, asking for help keeping the peace as things are starting to heat up.
Yeah, and it's always a question. I mean, the Vatican is always very low key on these kinds of things, really keeps it quiet. And what we see that, I think, in the recent couple of weeks when you've had various versions coming out from various other parties, but never from the Vatican, except to make a clarification perhaps on what someone else has said. So they're
Yes.
very discreet, and that's part of the diplomatic soft power of the Vatican is they're known for discretion. It's the one thing, Colleen, as you know, being around the Vatican, that often does not leak. Are
Yes,
these
that's
kinds
right.
of, everything else leaks, conclave, deliberations, everything else. But these kinds of things, that there is a great, I think, tradition of respect and discretion that goes along with these things. But again, it's always, so you're reading one side, and what was Maduro's goal in writing to the Vatican and
Hmm.
publicizing this thing. This was also the time, again, the military buildup, but also the military strikes, the U.S. military strikes on
Yes, we're
boats
starting, yeah.
in the Caribbean, which was, increasingly threatening, but also, just raised huge issues of international law. Just leave aside the entire Venezuela specific issue.
Yeah, right. And this is something that Leo talked about last week. So let's continue on through the timeline. Around November, Pope Leo did comment to journalists outside of Castel Gandolfo. He cautioned against violence. He said, violence never brings victory, and the key is to seek dialogue. Then again, in December, our colleague Elisabetta Piquet, Jerry's wife, asked Pope Leo aboard the papal plane about this buildup and these threats from the Trump administration. And Leo cautioned again against violence. He says there's other ways besides force to bring about change. He says you could use dialogue, you could use negotiations, you could even use economic pressure. And then we get to late December. And here's where it starts to get kind of interesting from reporting in recent weeks. So apparently, at this time, it was starting to become clear that, a U.S. strike on Venezuela to remove Maduro was increasingly possible. And the Washington Post revealed recently that on Christmas Eve, Cardinal Parolin called in the U.S. ambassador to the Holy See, Brian Burch, for an urgent meeting. Let's talk about what we know about this Christmas Eve urgent meeting.
Well, again, and it's great reporting by the Washington Post, but the other thing, according to their reporting, it was Parolin on Christmas Eve who calls in Brian Burch, the newly appointed Trump ambassador to the Holy See, and asking for mediation, talking about ways to ease Maduro out, find him a golden parachute, as it were, to Russia. Of all places, Russia, again, there's so much geopolitical connections here. Putin's Russia, very close to Maduro, and, Maduro's Venezuela, seen as an ally of Putin's Russia.
And in the background of all of this, the U.S. kind of backed peace deal negotiations in Ukraine that seem to favor Russia in some ways.
Exactly. So there's a lot of different cross-cutting dynamics going on here. So that he called him in, wanted to talk about easing Maduro out and to go to Russia. And nothing apparently came of that. But the other thing is that this is, again, a one-sided account, essentially.
That's right.
It's based on U.S. government documents. So these are memos that would have been written up by Ambassador Burch and his staff, sent to the State Department, which again has lost a lot of talent in the last year or so, a lot of historic talent with deep knowledge of the Vatican and the Catholic Church and of these other areas. So it's unclear really, what is lost in translation with these documents.
Yeah, the Vatican even came out and said shortly after this, that there was more to the story. They made a statement to the Post saying it's disappointing that parts of a confidential conversation were disclosed that do not accurately reflect the content of the conversation itself, which took place during the Christmas period. So, and Birch's spokesman deferred questions over to the State Department. They didn't comment. The Kremlin spokesman didn't comment. So this is really, it's a limited narrative, I think, worth taking with a grain of salt. But it's interesting that in the Washington Post reporting, they say that Parolin had been trying to reach U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio for several days. Interesting that he was kind of coming up against a wall there. And then also that Parolin was pushing Burch reportedly for clarity on what the U.S. was actually trying to achieve with this. Were they just trying to target drug traffickers, or were they really after regime change?
Yeah, and the fact that he couldn't get to Marco Rubio, all of these things are extraordinary, really, when you think of the history of U.S.-Vatican relations, certainly, where a Vatican Secretary of State could within a day, or in an emergent situation within moments, get a phone call with his counterpart in the United States. It's hard to know what is going on here, because also you have to look at the very top, at President Trump, who is very mercurial. Perhaps Marco Rubio didn't know what the strategy was or what the endgame was. But of course, also the United States didn't want to reveal its military plans. It wanted to keep these things secret. And perhaps, again, this indicates a lack of trust that they did not feel the Vatican could keep anything secret.
That's interesting. Yeah. And it also noted in this post article, it was actually the Vatican thing is just one piece of this larger report, which talks about how various different groups, various countries, including the Qataris, were trying to find a way for the US to accomplish its goals without, doing this kind of military operation. But clearly, none of those were successful because January 3rd, as we know, the US captures Maduro and his wife. They're actually in prison not too far from you right now, David, in New York.
I know. Here we were a few weeks ago deporting Venezuelans and others, and now we're importing a Venezuelan to the Brooklyn Detention Center.
That's right. So the following day after the attack at the Angelus address on Sunday, Pope Leo urged respect for the sovereignty of Venezuela and respect for its constitution. I thought these comments were interesting because, at least in my reading, they seem to get at both sides of this issue, right? Respect for the sovereignty of Venezuela, which to me, it seemed, to imply that Trump was not respecting the sovereignty of Venezuela. And then on the other side, respect for the Constitution. That is something that we know that Maduro was not doing.
Yes, I think very much. I think you read it exactly right. And those were the phrases that stuck out at me. The Pope was also obviously calling, he said, the common good, or the greater good of the Venezuelan people must be first and foremost. And he deplored any violence. And again, we have to recognize there were how many casualties in this operation, which
75.
75.
Around 75.
Yeah, and we see it. We tend to see it as a very clean operation, quote unquote, and we just surgical, yes, and as if we spirited Maduro out. But no, these are 75 dead people, and that's really the first thing the Pope went to. But again, I think what you cited, the rule of law, essentially sovereignty, I think, and respect for the Constitution, those were the two things that Leo was calling for, and I think that really signals his greater concern, his wider concern for reasserting multinational norms and the importance of those institutions.
Right, and that's exactly what he builds out a few days later, Pope Leo, in his address to the diplomats on January 9th. Since this address happened, I've heard it called his State of the World address. I had never heard that before, but his address to all of the diplomats from, I think, 184 nations who came, who are accredited to the Vatican and who came to hear the Pope talk about kind of what he thought of what is going on right now. It was a really wide-ranging talk. He covered religious liberty a lot. He talked about the importance of, like you were just saying, international law, multilateralism. And at the same time, he talked about the collapse of the post-World War II order, right? He had this headline line of this speech that said, "War is back in vogue and a seal for war is spreading." And then he talked about the principle established after the Second World War, which prohibited nations from using force to violate the borders of others, has been completely undermined. So he's deeply concerned about this. David, when I was chatting with you about this speech, you mentioned that it's really significant that he delivered it in English, and particularly American accented English. And so I wanted to ask you why that's so important.
Well, it really is striking, and I think that's been one of the most remarkable things about having an American pope, fundamentally at this time in the world when America's role is shifting and transforming enormously. And again, I've covered those State of the World speeches, those annual speeches that the Pope gives to he gives one to the Curia before Christmas, and then gives one to all the diplomats after Christmas, early in the new year, to kind of set the tone. almost always given in Italian, perhaps in Spanish under Francis. I'm not sure, or in I think in Paul VI days, perhaps in French, which was the accepted international diplomatic language. Not anymore. It's English. But again, you're having this American Pope talking with his very Midwestern accent, delivering this to these ambassadors from almost 200 countries around the world, and expressing what I think is very traditional Vatican diplomatic concerns and mores and ways of doing things, but also very American
What do you mean?
traditional ways of the kind of classic post-liberal, post-war liberal order that America had such a role in constructing.
Sure.
The respect for international law, the growth of international institutions, all of these things, many of them based in Rome, World Food Organization, and so many other UN agencies, for example. It's kind of been an integral part of this whole post-war structure and peace. Obviously, there was the great nuclear standoff during the Cold War, and again, I think we can go back to Pope John the 23rd, 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, that really, I think, aligned the Vatican with that multilateral world order very clearly, and was addressed to, uniquely, without precedent, all people of goodwill, not just Catholics. So I think that's what, I think is important. What struck me, that Pope Leo, the first American Pope, was really channeling both his papal tradition, but also his American roots.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to talking more about some of those themes with you in the second part of our show after we get through this very quick timeline of the Vatican's involvement with Venezuela. One thing that was also interesting that we should mention about this address to the diplomats is that he really didn't speak much about abortion or the environment, which are two issues that have often come up in kind of international papal addresses. So I just wanted to flag that as well for our listeners.
He did mention abortion at one point, and this is very much an omnibus speech. So it's really kind of a spanning the world kind of speech. So it's not unusual that he would mention things like that. I think it's unusual what you picked up on that he did not mention the environment, and he has made it's if you look at as we do, you and I do, the wider course of all of his daily speeches and various things, the environment has been front and center on so much of what he said. This is really, I think, his first specific mention of abortion, but it was also key, I think, if you look at the phrasing, to see that he put it in the context of social policies that would support mothers and women and families to make a different choice. So it was, I think that hasn't been unpacked enough. But there were other things, and he mentioned the he used the term Orwellian. I think
yes.
The first pope. I think
much has been made of that. He used the word Orwellian.
I did. I think Jim Keane wrote a great piece in America about Orwell and his relationship to the Catholic Church, and riffing off of this reference by the Pope. It's a great read, but it's an interesting citation talking about the use and misuse of language, and this from a pope whose first words from the balconies, you remember, and also repeatedly been about disarming vocabulary, about the power and the weaponry that words misused can represent.
Yeah, I'm really interested in digging more into that, maybe in a written piece later on, because it is so interesting that he really has been stressing this from the beginning. Like you said, he said this also in his early address to the journalists that I think you and I both attended shortly after the conclave, where he talked about the importance of disarming our language. And yeah, it's just something that I haven't thought about a lot, is, that language is kind of the beginning of our thought, is the beginning of our action. But he doesn't, play off things as just words. He says that's an important part of our disarmament as well.
And I think this is also an interesting relationship to his Americanness, and I think he's a great supporter of freedom of rights, freedom of speech, certainly. But it's different from our very, let's say, libertarian view of speech here, where it's, words are not violence. That's kind of one of our mantras. Words are not violence.
Yeah.
He's saying something different. I think he would see, as we've seen in our nation in recent days, recent weeks, months, that no, perhaps words can at least lead to violence. And that's what I think he is trying to say or get at in some way.
Right. And then to wrap us up, our last big kind of event that's unfolded in this timeline with the Vatican and Venezuela is that on Monday, January 12th, Pope Leo actually met with the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, who recently won the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, the Vatican didn't comment on the content, but Machado's office released a statement saying that she asked Leo to intercede to free hundreds of political prisoners in Venezuela, which I think is a thing that maybe the Vatican, they've certainly interceded for the release of political prisoners in the past. I think most recently in Cuba, actually.
Yes, that's the kind of thing definitely that I think the Vatican's diplomacy has more success on are things like that, getting somebody freed, getting political prisoners better treatment, that kind of thing. And you saw that again. I think most visibly, and Pope Leo mentioned it, the attempt of reunification of Ukrainian children taken by Russia with their parents. Those kinds of real humanitarian gestures where both parties on whatever side can see a benefit to doing that, and where the Vatican has really strong bona fides as a humanitarian go-between.
Yeah, certainly, and as a moral voice, right, which is kind of lacking. So you and I are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll get at some of the bigger picture kind of questions and analysis of this, of why Vatican diplomacy actually matters, why it's so different from the kind of diplomacy that we see from other nations, and we'll talk a little bit more about your New York Times opinion piece as well. Stay with us. Welcome back. So, in the first part of our conversation, David, we talked about kind of this series of events that has been unfolding between the Vatican and Venezuela, to a lesser extent, the United States, in recent months. But I think many of our listeners will hear all of that and say, okay, so what do we make of this? Like, why is this important? If the US is not listening to the Vatican and Venezuela continues to kind of appeal to the Vatican in different ways, why is this important at all? Is it just a dead end?
No, I think it's critically important, and that's goes to why I wanted to write that op-ed in the New York Times that you referenced. That the idea that with America, I think you would say retreating from the international stage, retreating into our spheres of influence, as they're saying, and retreating from much of the humanitarian obligations that we've traditionally had, and the moral language that we have used, especially since the post-war era, that there needs to be a repository, a guardian of that kind of soft power, we might call it, that moral soft power, and that you're finding that in Pope Leo, an American pope, who is sounding very Catholic and very classically Vatican diplomatic tropes, but in his American accent and with his kind of American, old-fashioned, shall we say, kind of American way of being and approach to the world. And there's the fact that he is saying these things. He's talking about multilateralism. He's talking about dialogue. He's talking about the importance of negotiations. He's talking about good faith, goodwill, freedom of religion, these kinds of things. You're seeing the world looking to that. They're looking for that, and they're seeing it in, of all people, the Roman pontiff.
Yeah, it was interesting. You drew out in the op-ed that kind of the founders of European unification, right, Robert Schuman and so on, they were, many of them, devout Catholics. And then here we have the cardinals electing an American pope who, as you say in the article, maybe they elected him because he epitomizes the America they miss.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, the American cardinals, as you know, we were there in post-conclave, and everyone was dishing about the secret conclave, and the American cardinals, the American electors, I think were very clear they didn't want to spike the ball.
Yes.
First American pope, and they're like,
Yes.
no, it wasn't because he was American, wasn't because
we
he was
weren't thinking
American.
about it at all.
No, we weren't thinking about it at all, and I get it, and I mean, I think that's a very diplomatic, so to speak, way to approach it. And but you talk to people from the Southern Hemisphere, cardinals and electors, and some of them publicly, and many of them privately, say no. Part of it, obviously they were electing Robert Prevost, Cardinal Prevost, for a lot of reasons and a lot of other reasons. But his Americanness, his, again, old-fashioned American, they were kind of electing an American for an America that they miss, that is disappearing from the stage. Not just someone to go mano a mano with Donald Trump, who's got 3 years left in his second term, but someone who, will be there for the long term.
Yeah, right. This is a young pope. This is likely to be a long papacy. I remember being asked the night of the election on ABC News, the question was, what about the Trump of it all? But, was this man elected to kind of be a counterweight to Trump? And I agree with what you say in this op-ed, which is that he's not looking for a fight with Trump. He's looking past him. He's playing a much longer game.
Yeah, and that's classic Catholic Church. Church thinks in centuries, not news cycles, as we say. And, and so that is, it's a wider game. It's a 1.4 billion member church, as you know. He's got to speak for these other folks. As we've said, when the Trump administration cut the USAID funds, for us this was a terrible political and constitutional issue, as so many of these things are. In other parts of the world, this is life and death. You've got people in Africa and Asia, other places where they have hundreds, thousands of people dying because of these cuts. So Pope Leo is speaking for them. And again, not mano a mano, not just to get into pick a fight with Trump at all, but to represent a different point of view. And one I think that they see coinciding with what used to be a traditional American aspect.
We've talked a lot about kind of the international politics relationships here, but I'm also interested in kind of the message to the Catholic Church, maybe especially the American Catholic Church. Do you think that Leo is offering kind of an alternative to Trump, or maybe J.D. Vance as kind of the most famous American Catholic at this point?
I think that's a really good point as well, Colleen, which I couldn't bring up in the op-ed, but I think it's this isn't just a message again to the Trump administration, but it's also very much a message to a large segment of the American church, which has also kind of taken this retreat from the wider world, which is incredibly ironic given that American Catholics have traditionally not only been immigrants from other parts of the world, as Robert Prevost, Pope Leo, has identified himself, his own American story as an immigrant story, but they've identified with this wider Catholic Church, this 1.4 billion member church around the world, in a way other religious traditions have not.
Well, and the thing that historically really scared American politicians, right? Which is why U.S. Catholics had such a hard time getting into U.S. politics, although now that that distinction almost seems not to exist.
Exactly. And I mean, I think it was striking that in an interview, J.D. Vance, recent interview, criticized Pope Leo as being too European. Because again, we've been talking about Venezuela, but we also, Pope Leo was also very critical of the Trump administration and the retreat, the criticism of NATO, the criticism of the European-American alliance in the context of trying to make peace with Ukraine and Russia, but very critical of anything that would undermine that historic alliance. And here you have J.D. Vance, the Catholic convert vice president, saying, no, I think the Pope is just too European. That's a striking criticism.
It is. It also kind of reminds me of the reactions to Laudato Si when that came out. This kind of the Pope should stay in his lane criticism. It seems to echo some of that. But that brings me a little bit to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which was how Pope Leo's response on this stacks up with past popes. Pope Francis was often also critical well, he was certainly critical of Donald Trump and the Trump administration. He was also critical many times of the weakness of these multilateral institutions like the UN. He often was, not only lamenting, as Leo did, that they're no longer strong, but also saying, like, they're focusing on the wrong things. He would talk about ideological colonization. He would talk about this idea that, a more traditional or conservative country would have to adopt more progressive norms in order to receive aid, this kind of thing. Leo here in his talk to the diplomats was certainly lamenting the weakness of those organizations. But I'm interested in how you think his message stacks up to Francis and maybe other past recent popes as well, since I know that you've covered many of them.
Yeah, well, I think it's and it's an interesting kind of look back and compare and contrast. Look, every pope responds to the context that they find themselves in, and I think Pope Francis, he was just a rhetorical gift for journalists.
It was never boring.
I know, never boring. Automatic lead, bang. It's like, which one of those is going to lead the story? And he's just so quotable and so good. But that was part of, it wasn't just a game. It wasn't just playing to the crowd. It was part of his prophetic stance. And I think, in a sense, that his rhetoric was so powerful and was really matched the emerging populisms of this past 10, 15 years. Francis was elected in 2013, and Donald Trump came on the scene in 2015, and has been part of this world leadership and this nascent and rampaging, as many would say, kind of nationalist populism for the past decade.
And here's a pope who was maybe as much of a loose cannon as the president.
Exactly, in many ways, and on behalf of the good, and behalf of a more Christian humanistic, let's say, world polity and common good. But so he had that rhetoric. He did not have, I think, the policy chops or the policy approach that I think Pope Leo has. And Pope Leo has criticisms, but he also wants to, realizing where we are in this day, in 2026, 2025, that that reform, that building up and reforming from within is more important than just criticizing or tearing down. And again, so I think that's a contrast. That's where we're moving. And that's part of Leo's personality. It's part of his Americanness, I think. This goes with his approach to reform within the Catholic Church. This is not just the foreign policy, yes, and the global community and communion, but it's also within the church. How you saw Pope Francis was somebody who kind of broke things. He said we've got to do things differently. So he broke stuff. Leo is finding out, how are we going to put this together? Again, how are we going to solidify this push, this desire for reform? So I think that's the contrast there. And I think, going back, you also see, I think Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, was someone, he was a quiet theologian, a scholar, elected really as a kind of a bridge pope, a role he served. But I think one of his, Sandro Magister, one of his favorite writers, said when Pope Benedict was elected in 2005, he said, it'll be more gospel, less diplomacy. That's not really how the Vatican has always operated. It's always been a diplomatic player out there, and that didn't work out really so well, I think.
I think that quote about more gospel, less diplomacy, it was perhaps a big shift, or was signifying what could have been a big shift after John Paul II, who was like such a big geopolitical player.
Yeah, that legacy of John Paul, and again, there's that whole push to call him John Paul the Great, not just Saint John Paul, but
right.
John Paul the Great, which again, only I think 2 or 3 popes in history have had Leo the Great among them, and Gregory the Great. But again, that was maybe the hangover, frankly, of John Paul's remarkable legacy and role in the world stage. Elected in 1978, travels to Poland. You all know the history. Millions coming out in when we had the Soviet Union, the Cold War, a world divided in two between East and West, good and bad, many would say. The empire of evil, as Ronald Reagan put it. And he goes to Soviet-controlled Poland, millions coming out in the streets. That ushers in that whole decade of the 80s and Glasnost and Mikhail Gorbachev. It ends in November 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Pope John Paul is a hero in that whole struggle. But then what comes after that? The 90s, the upheavals, social, political, cultural, religious upheavals. And that binary world disappeared. And you have all these kind of, which I think Pope Francis put it very well, this kind of World War III, piecemeal.
Fought piecemeal.
Fought
Yeah.
piecemeal, which is, again, a phrase, Colleen, that Pope Leo has also
Right.
invoked several times, including in his most recent address, the State of the World address. So that was a world that I think John Paul, he was seen as such an important figure, but he wasn't able to navigate. And of course, he was getting older. He was ill. That gave way to Pope Benedict, as we said, who was a scholar theologian, not as interested in these things. So the Vatican, after this great legacy of the 80s and early 90s and John Paul II, kind of gave way, moved off the global stage. I mean, you had after 9/11, when the Bush administration, very Vatican-friendly Republican Bush administration, wanted to go to war in Iraq. You know the story. You
Yes, I
had
do.
the Vatican, John Paul II, dead set against this invasion, sending his personal nuncio, Laghi, there to the White House. Shows up and says, George Bush says, "Do you want to pray, Your Eminence?" And Laghi says, "No, I prayed before I got here. Let's talk."
Yeah.
And it did no good. So again, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. I mean, the Vatican is always there as a mediator, as a peacemaker. It doesn't always work. Even when you're talking to your allies. And so I think that was a significant moment in 2003, and an indicator of where the Vatican's kind of stock in the global community had gone. And I
Yeah.
think that's changing now.
You do. So could we be headed for another John Paul II diplomatic papacy?
Well, yeah, I think so. Between the salience of Pope Francis and now the role of Pope Leo, this first American pope, in many respects, not so much because of what Pope Leo has done, although it's important that he's a very stand-up guy. He's not, as his brother says, not quiet or shy. He'll say what he means when he means to say it. But it's because of the absence, I think, of the American voice on the world stage. Remember, John Paul II, yes, was a remarkable figure, but he was working very much in tandem with an American president, Ronald Reagan, and an America that was such a player on the global stage.
Yeah, that is a really, really interesting difference. Now, I'm interested that you attribute so much of this to Leo himself, because when I was reading the address to the diplomats, kind of my first thought was a lot of this sounds like Cardinal Parolin. Cardinal Parolin, Secretary of State, was a frontrunner in the conclave. Leo himself took office and said he had quite a learning curve when it came to being an international leader. And so my thought was that, especially with all of the expertise on Venezuela in his Secretariat of State, that he would probably just kind of let Parolin and maybe Pena Parra take the lead. But you seem to think that Leo's got kind of a stronger hand in this. I'm interested in that.
I think this is both and. That's a really good point you bring
Okay.
up, because I think you've got to be, and it's also, look, I mean, Leo's given so many wonderful speeches and important speeches in every day, and he's not writing them all.
No, of course not. No pope does.
I know, obviously they don't, but increasingly you have to say, what are we 8 months into the papacy, to this papacy. He's starting to identify collaborators who he resonates with and people he trusts, and he's starting to be able to give more talking points, saying what he wants to say. He's doing more of the drafting and the writing of some of these critical things. So I think it really is a both and, but I think the important thing, and I think it is, this really reflects, this state of the world really reflects the traditional diplomatic stances of the Holy See, led by Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who's been Secretary of State for 13 years, been in the diplomatic corps his entire career, his ecclesiastical career, which is one reason, again, he was papabile in the last conclave, as you know. So I think this does reflect that, but I think the important thing is that Leo has also signaled that he's going to go through normal channels, that he trusts the Secretary of State, that he's letting them do this. You had in Pope Francis a pope who was not particularly a partner with his own curia, who often went his own way. He was something of a freelancer, certainly. And you remember those early days of the Russia invasion of Ukraine, where he was trying to both sides, that he was doing a little bit of his own personal diplomacy. Did not work out well whatsoever. There are times when you need the professionals. And we're finding that in the United States diplomatically, and I think Pope Francis or Pope Leo's realized very much that he wants to be. He's come in on so many levels trying to reassure the curia. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. At the same time saying you're going to be held to account. And I think we can probably expect some changes, maybe even at the Secretary of State going forward.
Mm-hmm. My last question for you, just to wrap this all up, is what do we think that the Vatican's endgame is here? Because the Vatican is pushing for peace. They talk about the good of the Venezuelan people. Obviously, the Venezuelan people themselves have different opinions about what their greater good would be, what would best serve it. And at the same time, we have kind of these questions in the background about whether the Vatican can be effective in doing this. I know that, the Vatican often is prioritizing kind of keeping dialogue open, no matter who's in charge, so that they can try to eke out some good, some positive effect, and they see dialogue itself as a good. Sometimes that kind of comes at the cost of them being able to maybe affect the changes that they want to see, right? They're criticized for this a lot in the Vatican-China deal, for example, where there are humanitarian abuses that go on, and they are seen as not pushing back strongly enough and keeping dialogue open when they actually can't make a difference. So all that in mind, where do we think the Vatican is pushing on Venezuela? What do you think that they want to see?
Well, I think there's a two-stage, two-level game that's going on, or not game, but a policy that's going on. One is at the diplomatic level, the stuff we're talking about so much, and the international diplomatic level, where they want a peaceful transition. They want to see tensions de-escalated. They don't want things to get out of control. A lot of it is, if you can't bring peace, some wonderful kind of utopia right away, you don't want to put gas on the fire. And you have a lot of arsonists out there in the world right now. And they want to stop that from happening. They don't want bloodshed. They don't want further economic harm. But in a sense, again, as we've said, the Vatican on that diplomatic level is at the mercy of world powers who have all of the power, all of the secular power. The other level I think that's important that they're working on, though, is the church in Venezuela, which we often tend to forget. The church in these countries, as you say, in China, just trying to keep the church alive, the church as a player. Because the real future of Venezuela or any country is going to be created on the ground, in society, in communities. And the church, especially in a Catholic country like Venezuela, has to be part of that. So the Vatican really wants to give cover and provide space for the Venezuelan church itself to create that future.
That's absolutely right. All right, David, this has been a fascinating conversation. Could talk to you all day, but I'll let you go. Thank you so much for filling in on the show this week. Our listeners can read your New York Times op-ed linked in our show notes.
It's always great to be here. Look forward to having Jerry back.
Inside the Vatican is a production of America Media. This episode was produced and engineered by Kevin Christopher Robles. Production assistance from Adam Buckmueller and Will Gualtieri. Our executive producer is Sebastian Gomes. To keep up with the latest coverage out of the Vatican, you can follow America Magazine at americamagazine.org and subscribe at americamagazine.org/subscribe. For America Media with David Gibson, I'm your host and producer, Colleen Dulle. We'll see you next time.